At our son's new mansion party, my wife whispered, "We have to go." What she said next left me completely frozen. If you have ever had someone mistake your kindness for weakness, please hit the like button, subscribe to Humble Dad Stories, so you do not miss the rest of my story. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and what time it is there right now. It means the world to me. My name is William Harper. I am 69 years old, and for over 4 decades I built an industrial manufacturing company from a single leased warehouse into a regional operation that employed over 1,100 people before I sold my controlling stake and retired 3 years ago. I did not inherit a single dime. I started with a rusted forklift, a handshake, and a line of credit I nearly lost sleep over every night for the first 5 years. But none of that mattered on the night I sat at my own son's dinner table and watched him try to force a pen into my hand in front of 300 guests. None of that mattered until the moment I snapped that pen in half and told an entire ballroom exactly who my son really was. But let me back up. Let me tell you exactly how this nightmare began. Because to understand why I reacted the way I did, you have to understand the life my wife and I built before any of this happened. I grew up the oldest of 4 children in a steel town outside of Pittsburgh, where my father worked the mills for 31 years before his lungs finally gave out. I promised myself young that I would build something that outlasted a factory floor, something with my own name on the door, instead of someone else's. I met my wife Eleanor at a community college night class when I was 23, both of us working full days and studying at night, and I knew within 3 months that I was going to marry her. We married the following spring in her uncle's backyard. A simple ceremony, folding chairs, a borrowed record player, and I promised her that whatever I built with my hands, I would build it for both of us, together, for the rest of our lives. Those early years of our marriage were leaner than most people today could imagine. Eleanor worked as a bookkeeper for a small trucking company, while I spent my days on the shop floor of a fabrication plant, learning everything I could about metalwork, tooling, and supply chains, saving every spare dollar toward the day I could start something of my own. We lived in a small rented duplex with a leaking roof. I patched myself every spring, and Eleanor used to joke that she married a man who smelled permanently of machine oil, no matter how many times he showered. I started Harper Industrial Manufacturing when I was 29, leasing a single warehouse with a loan, co-signed by my father-in-law, a man who believed in me more than I believed in myself in those early years. Eleanor kept our household books alongside the company's for the first 3 years, refusing to let me hire an outside accountant until we could genuinely afford one, insisting that every dollar mattered too much to trust to someone who did not love the business the way we did. Eleanor and I had one son, Michael, born 9 years into our marriage, after a difficult pregnancy that nearly cost Eleanor her life. When he finally arrived healthy, I remember standing in that hospital corridor swearing to myself that this boy would never know one day of the uncertainty I grew up with. I built Harper Industrial Manufacturing from a single leased warehouse into a company with 3 plants across 2 states. I worked 16-hour days for the better part of 2 decades. I missed dance recitals. I missed more birthdays than I care to admit. Eleanor never once complained, because she understood what we were building, and she raised Michael almost single-handedly during those years, teaching him, she believed, the same quiet, unshowy values that had carried us out of hardship. Looking back now, I understand I made a mistake somewhere in that stretch of years. I gave Michael everything I never had as a boy, and somewhere along the way, I think I forgot to also give him the thing that actually mattered, which was the memory of building something from nothing. He grew up in a large house, with a swimming pool, and a housekeeper twice a week. He drove a new car the day he turned 17. He went to a private university I paid for in full, cash, no loans, no understanding whatsoever of what any of it actually cost. I told myself I was giving him a head start in a world I never had access to. I did not realize, until it was almost too late, that I had also been handing him a blindfold. Eleanor and I retired quietly, a little over 3 years ago, once Michael had married, and, we believed, fully settled into adult life on his own. We moved into a smaller home on the lake, took up fishing together most mornings, and spent our Sundays with old friends we had known for 30 years. It was, for a long stretch, the calmest and happiest chapter of our entire married life. Michael had married Emma 2 years before our retirement, a bright, ambitious woman who worked in commercial real estate development. Emma's mother, Gloria Benson, was a woman I had only met a handful of times at family gatherings. Always immaculately dressed. Always talking loudly about investment properties and business ventures that never seemed to quite materialize into anything Eleanor or I could verify. I did not think much of her at first. Every family has that one relative who talks bigger than their bank account, and I assumed Gloria was simply that relative in Emma's family. Harmless bluster, nothing more. I was wrong about that, and it very nearly cost my wife and me everything we had spent 40 years building. I think, looking back, part of why I was so slow to see the truth about Gloria was that Eleanor and I had spent our entire marriage surrounded by people who were exactly what they appeared to be. My old business partners, my longtime foreman at the plant, the men and women who worked alongside me for decades. They were plain-spoken, hard-working people who did not perform wealth they did not have. Gloria was something different, something I had not built the instincts to recognize quickly. A woman who spoke fluently in the language of success, without ever quite showing the underlying substance of it. She talked about a downtown condo she was between properties on. She mentioned a boutique consulting firm she ran that never seemed to have an actual office address anyone could point to. Eleanor, with the sharper social instincts of the two of us, mentioned once, quietly, over dinner after a family gathering, that something about Gloria never quite added up to her. I remember telling her, gently, that not everyone needed to explain their finances to us. That it was not our business how Emma's mother chose to live her life. I have thought about that conversation many times since, wishing I had listened to my wife's instincts, instead of dismissing them out of politeness. 6 weeks ago, Michael called Eleanor and me, his voice buzzing with an excitement I had not heard from him in years, inviting us to a housewarming celebration at a new property he and Emma had just purchased. "You have to see this place, Dad," he told me over the phone. "It's everything we've worked for. We want you and Mom there for the very first party in the house." Eleanor cried a little when she hung up the phone, the good kind of crying, telling me how proud she was that our son had built something of his own to be excited about, something separate from the money we had already given him over the years for his wedding, his first business venture that failed, his second one that barely survived. The night of the party arrived on a warm evening in early autumn. The house itself, when we pulled up the long gravel drive, took my breath away in a way I was not prepared for. A sprawling stone manor set back from the road, easily 12,000 square feet, with manicured hedges, a circular fountain in the front courtyard, and enough cars already parked along the drive to suggest at least 200 guests had already arrived. I remember turning to Eleanor in the passenger seat and saying, only half joking, "I hope our son knows what a mortgage on a place like this actually costs every month." We were greeted at the door by a valet in a black vest, escorted through a marble foyer with a chandelier easily 8 feet across, and into a great room already filled with champagne, string lighting, and the low hum of a live jazz trio playing in the corner. Michael found us within minutes, beaming, pulling Eleanor into a tight hug, shaking my hand with both of his, the way he used to when he was trying to impress me as a boy. "What do you think, Dad? Can you believe this is ours?" I told him it was extraordinary. I meant it. I had no reason yet to feel anything other than pride standing in that great room, watching my son play host to what appeared to be half the local business community, watching Emma work the room in a stunning green dress, introducing herself as though she had lived in wealth her entire life, rather than the modest upbringing she had actually come from. I spent those first 40 minutes doing what I have always done at any gathering, quietly observing rather than performing. A habit built across 4 decades of walking factory floors and reading rooms, before ever opening my mouth in a negotiation. I noticed, without quite letting myself think too hard about it yet, a few small details that sat oddly against the evening's celebratory mood. Gloria Benson, dressed in a shimmering navy gown that likely cost more than my first car, moved through the room with the particular confidence of a woman who believed the house belonged to her, greeting guests near the entrance before Michael or Emma had even reached them, accepting compliments about her beautiful new home with a practiced modesty that struck me, even then, as slightly too rehearsed. I noticed Michael checking his phone twice during otherwise animated conversations, his jaw tightening briefly each time, before he tucked it away and resumed his easy host's smile. None of it registered as anything more than the ordinary texture of a large party. I had no idea yet how much weight those small details would carry, only a few minutes later. It was nearly 40 minutes into the party that everything changed. Eleanor had wandered off toward the study to admire the built-in bookshelves, something she always does at any new house we visit, unable to resist looking at what people choose to read. I lost sight of her for a few minutes, caught up in a conversation with one of Michael's business partners near the bar, and when she reappeared beside me, her face had gone pale in a way I had not seen since the year her own mother passed. She gripped my forearm with a strength that startled me, her fingers digging into my sleeve hard enough to leave marks I would notice later that night. "We need to leave," she whispered, close to my ear, her voice trembling. "Right now, William, please." I asked her what was wrong, keeping my own voice low, aware of the crowd of guests around us. She would not answer, only shook her head and pulled me toward the door, offering some quick excuse to Michael about a headache and an early morning appointment neither of us actually had. Michael looked disappointed but did not press, distracted by another guest calling his name from across the room. Eleanor did not speak another word until we were locked inside our car, pulling slowly down that long gravel driveway, the lights of the mansion glowing warm and golden behind us in the rearview mirror. Finally, once we were on the main road, she turned to me, her hands still shaking in her lap. "I found something in the study," she said. "On the desk, in a folder, half hidden under some other papers. It was a copy of the property deed, William, for this house." "All right," I said carefully. "And?" "It's not in Michael's name," she said. "It's not in Emma's name either. William, the deed is registered to a woman named Gloria Benson Holdings, LLC. It's Emma's mother's company. This house isn't Michael's. It never was." I remember the specific silence that settled over that car for the rest of the drive home, the hum of the tires on the highway, the only sound between us, both of us turning the same impossible question over in our minds, without either of us willing to say it out loud yet. Why would our son throw a housewarming party, invite 200 guests, stand in that great room accepting congratulations on a home that legally belonged, on paper, to his own mother-in-law? I did not sleep that night. I lay awake beside Eleanor, staring at the ceiling, running through every conversation Michael and I had shared over the past several months about his finances, his business ventures, the vague references he had made to restructuring some assets for tax purposes, that I had, foolishly, taken at face value because he is my son, and I wanted so badly to believe he had finally learned to manage money the way I had spent decades trying to teach him. The next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office myself, requesting a full title search on the property, before I said a single word to Michael. What I found there confirmed exactly what Eleanor had told me in the car, and then some. I remember the clerk who helped me that morning, a patient young woman who pulled up the file without asking a single question about why an elderly man wanted to review documents on a property that was not his own. I sat at a small wooden table near the window, county records stacked in front of me, autumn light slanting through the blinds, and worked through the paperwork with the same methodical patience I once applied to reviewing supplier contracts decades earlier, page by page, line by line, refusing to let myself jump to conclusions before I had actually confirmed what I was looking at. The property had been purchased 11 weeks earlier for $4.7 million. The deed was indeed registered to Gloria Benson Holdings, LLC, but the down payment, a staggering $1.8 million wire transfer, had originated from an account I recognized instantly, because I had helped set it up myself years earlier. It was the corporate operating account for Harper Industrial Consulting, a smaller advisory firm I had spun off from my original manufacturing company and handed over to Michael to run independently 3 years ago as a graduation gift into full financial adulthood, my way of finally letting him build something of his own, with my blessing and my name still quietly behind it. I sat in my truck in that recorder's office parking lot for a long time after printing those title documents. The same particular stillness settling over me that I imagine settles over any man who spends his life building something honest, only to discover, in the space of a single morning, that the foundation beneath his own family may have quietly rotted out from under him without his noticing. I thought about every wire transfer I had ever approved for Michael over the years, every loan, every gift, every moment I had told myself that trusting my son with more responsibility was simply good parenting, rather than an invitation for exactly this kind of exploitation. I thought about the day I signed over Harper Industrial Consulting to him 3 years earlier, shaking his hand in my old office, telling him how proud I was, how ready I believed he was to build something entirely his own. I did not yet know, sitting in that parking lot, just how thoroughly that pride was about to be tested. My son had used $1.8 million from a company that still, in part, carried my name and my reputation, to fund a down payment on a mansion legally owned by his mother-in-law. I called Michael that afternoon, keeping my voice level, the same way I had negotiated countless labor contracts and supplier disputes over 4 decades, without ever once raising my voice above what a calm conversation required. "Michael," I said, "I need to ask you about the property deed on the new house." There was a pause on the line, longer than I expected. "Dad, look, it's more complicated than it probably looks," he said. "Gloria has this real estate structure set up. It's actually a really smart tax play. The property gets held under her LLC for depreciation purposes, but functionally, it's ours. Dad, it's completely ours. We just structured the ownership for efficiency." "And the $1.8 million from Harper Industrial Consulting," I said, "was that also structured for efficiency?" Another pause, longer this time. "That's a loan, Dad. An internal company loan. It's completely standard practice. Businesses do this all the time. I'm going to repay it back to the company within the year. It's already documented." I asked him to send me that documentation. He told me he would, sometime that week. He did not. I did not raise my voice on that call. I remember, in fact, keeping my eyes fixed on a framed photograph on my study wall while I spoke. A picture of Michael at maybe 7 years old, standing proudly beside a treehouse I had built for him one summer, sawdust still in his hair, grinning at the camera with the kind of uncomplicated joy children have before the world teaches them what things cost. I stared at that photograph the entire length of the call, searching for some thread connecting that boy to the man on the other end of the line. And for the first time since Eleanor grabbed my arm in that mansion's great room, I felt something crack quietly in my chest that had nothing to do with anger at all. I have learned across 40 years in business that the moment you show a man you suspect him, you teach him exactly how carefully he needs to hide the rest of what he's doing. So instead, I made a decision that morning that would define the next several weeks of my life. I told Michael I understood, that I trusted his financial instincts, that I was sorry for jumping to conclusions after a long night. I played, quite deliberately, the role of a slightly confused, easily reassured old man who had misread a piece of paperwork he did not fully understand. It was the best performance of my entire career. 3 days after that phone call, I visited Michael's office downtown under the guise of dropping off a set of fishing rods I had promised to lend him for a trip he'd mentioned taking that weekend. His office door was cracked open when I arrived, and through the reflection in the glass wall separating his office from the hallway, I caught sight of something that stopped me cold in my tracks. Michael was hunched over his computer, moving quickly, deleting folder after folder from what I could clearly see was a financial directory labeled with dates going back nearly a year. His shoulders were tense, his movements hurried, the posture of a man erasing evidence rather than simply tidying his desktop. I knocked before he noticed me watching, and by the time he looked up, his screen had already gone dark, minimized, innocent. "Dad? Hey, didn't hear you come in," he said, a little too brightly, standing quickly to shake my hand. I handed him the fishing rods, made small talk about the weather for a few minutes, and left without mentioning what I had seen reflected in that glass wall. But I knew, walking back to my truck in that parking garage, that whatever I had stumbled into was no longer simply a story about an oddly structured house deed. A man does not delete a year's worth of financial folders in a panic over a routine tax strategy. A man does that when he is hiding something he knows would end him if it were ever found. I called Eleanor from the parking garage before I even started the engine. "I think this is bigger than the house," I told her. "I think we need to find out exactly how much bigger." Eleanor was quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment. "William," she finally said, "whatever this turns out to be, promise me you won't let it turn you into someone you're not. I've watched you build an entire company without ever raising your voice at a single person who didn't deserve it. Don't let Michael be the reason that changes now." I promised her I would try, though I remember sitting in that parking garage afterward, gripping the steering wheel, understanding that keeping that particular promise was going to be the hardest thing I had done since the early years of building the company from nothing. Over the following 2 weeks, I returned to the mansion on 3 separate occasions. always under some gentle, grandfatherly pretense. Dropping off a housewarming gift I had forgotten. Bringing over a toolbox to help hang a mirror Emma had mentioned needing help with. Stopping by simply to see how they were settling in. Each visit, I made a point of wandering, slowly, unhurried. The way an old man wanders through a house he is admiring, rather than a man conducting a search. On my second visit, in a guest bedroom closet that had been converted into a makeshift file storage room, I found a banker's box that had not been fully unpacked, its lid slightly askew. Inside were documents bearing Gloria Benson's name, casino win/loss statements from 3 different riverboat casinos, totaling losses in excess of $600,000 over the previous 18 months, and several letters from collection agencies referencing defaulted personal loans I recognized as originating from at least 2 different predatory lending companies I had encountered decades earlier in my own business dealings. Companies known for aggressive collection practices against people in serious financial distress. I remember sitting on the edge of that guest bed for a long moment after closing the banker's box, my hands unsteady, listening to the muffled sound of Emma laughing at something downstairs, oblivious to what I had just found 2 floors above her. I thought about every conversation Eleanor and I had shared over the years about Gloria's various investments, the boutique consulting firm with no office, the downtown condo she was perpetually between, and I understood now, with a sickening clarity, that none of it had ever been the harmless bluster I once assumed. It had been a woman slowly drowning, reaching for whatever she could find to keep herself afloat. And my son, whether out of misguided love for his wife's family or something closer to willing complicity, had apparently decided that reaching hand belonged wrapped around my company's finances. Gloria Benson was not simply a woman who talked bigger than her bank account. Gloria Benson was drowning in debt, and somehow, my son and his company were now tangled directly into whatever she was doing to try to stay afloat. I did not confront anyone with what I found in that closet. Instead, I called an old contact of mine, a retired forensic accountant named Harold Weiss, who had helped my own manufacturing company untangle a supplier fraud scheme nearly 15 years earlier. A meticulous, quiet man, who had since built a reputation doing exactly this kind of discreet investigative work for families and small businesses across the state. Harold agreed to meet me at a diner outside of town, away from anyone who might recognize either of us, and I laid out everything I had found so far: the deed, the wire transfer, the deleted folders, the casino statements, the collection letters. Harold was quiet for a long moment after I finished, stirring his coffee slowly. "William," he finally said, "what you're describing has the shape of something I've seen before. More times than I'd like to admit. A family member with financial desperation, access to a relative's company accounts, and a pattern of moving money through structures designed to look legitimate on the surface. If your son has access to Harper Industrial Consulting's books, and Gloria has debts this size, I'd bet a great deal of money you're going to find funds moving out of that company disguised as something else. Consulting fees, advisory retainers, something with enough of a paper trail to survive a casual glance, but not a real audit. Before I tell you what Harold found in those company records, I need to tell you about something else that happened during that same stretch of weeks, because it very nearly complicated everything Gerald and I were quietly trying to build. Word travels fast in the kind of business circles I spent 40 years moving through, and somehow, despite my best efforts to keep the situation contained, a rumor began circulating among a handful of my former industry contacts that William Harper was having some kind of trouble with his son, and might be looking to quietly sell off his remaining minority stake in Harper Industrial Consulting. I do not know precisely how that rumor started. I suspect it traced back to a comment Michael made at a golf outing. The same kind of careless bragging men do when they are trying to sound more important than they actually are, in front of people they want to impress. Whatever its origin, it reached a man named Douglas Ferris, a competitor who had circled my original manufacturing company for years, twice attempting hostile acquisitions that I had successfully fought off in the early 2000s. Douglas called me on a Sunday afternoon, his voice dripping with rehearsed sympathy, asking if everything was all right, mentioning he had heard some things through the grapevine, and wondering if I might be interested in a quick, friendly buyout of my remaining equity position, an offer that, on paper, looked generous, but sat, I knew instantly, at roughly 40% below the position's actual value. I understood immediately, sitting in my study with that phone against my ear, that Douglas had absolutely no idea how close he was standing to the edge of a legal disaster still unfolding beneath the surface. If I had sold my minority stake to him during that window, it would have complicated the ownership structure Gerald and I needed intact to pursue Michael's fraud cleanly, and it might have alerted Michael that something beyond his control was shifting around him before we were ready to move. I told Douglas politely that everything was fine, that I had no interest in selling, and that I appreciated his concern for an old rival's well-being. He pushed twice more over the following weeks, each time a little more transparent about his opportunism, and each call reminded me of a lesson I had learned decades earlier, and was relearning now in the hardest possible way. Vultures do not care whose blood is on the ground. They only care that blood is there at all, and they can smell it circling a family from remarkable distances. I never told Michael about Douglas Ferris's calls. It remained, until now, a detail known only to Gerald, Eleanor, and me. But I share it because it illustrates something important about that stretch of weeks. I was not only quietly protecting myself from my own son's scheme, I was also fending off opportunists, circling from entirely separate directions, all of them drawn by the same faint scent of a family in crisis, and navigating both required a kind of patience I am not certain I possessed before this entire ordeal began. I hired Harold on the spot, retaining him formally through Gerald Voss, the same sharp, quiet attorney who has handled every significant legal matter of my career for over 20 years. Gerald structured the engagement carefully, ensuring that whatever Harold uncovered would be gathered in a way that could withstand legal scrutiny later, rather than dismissed as a father's private suspicion. It took Harold 11 days to complete his initial pass through Harper Industrial Consulting's financial records I still had limited legal access to, review as the company's original founder and minority equity holder, a detail Michael had apparently forgotten when he agreed to keep me on the cap table years earlier as a formality, never imagining I would ever actually exercise the access it quietly still afforded me. During those 11 days, while Harold worked quietly through boxes of financial records at his home office, I continued playing the part of an easily reassured father, calling Michael every few days, with harmless, pleasant conversation, asking about his week, mentioning a fishing trip Eleanor and I were planning, giving him absolutely no indication that anything beneath the surface had shifted. It was, without question, the hardest acting I have ever done in my life. There were nights during that stretch when Eleanor found me sitting alone in the dark kitchen at 2 a.m, unable to sleep, turning over every memory I had of Michael as a boy, trying to locate the exact moment where the son I raised became capable of doing what I now suspected he was doing. She would sit with me at that table, without saying much, just her hand resting over mine, the same quiet steadiness that had carried both of us through every hard year of our marriage. Whatever this turns out to be, she told me one of those nights, we face it the way we've faced everything else. Together, and without losing ourselves in the process. I held on to that sentence tightly during the following weeks. What Harold found dismantled any remaining doubt I had been holding on to out of simple fatherly hope. Over the previous 14 months, Michael had authorized a total of $3.4 million in payments from Harper Industrial Consulting to 4 separate shell entities, each one registered under slightly varied names of strategic advisory or market consulting firms. Each one, upon closer inspection by Harold's team, traceable back to addresses connected to Gloria Benson or to a business partner of hers who had a prior history of financial fraud convictions in a neighboring state. The payments were disguised on the company's books as legitimate consulting retainers, complete with fabricated invoices for services that, according to every employee Harold discreetly interviewed under the pretense of a routine vendor audit, had never actually been performed. Of that $3.4 million, roughly $1.9 million had gone directly toward paying off Gloria's casino debts and defaulted personal loans, effectively rescuing her from what would have otherwise been a catastrophic personal bankruptcy, and, quite possibly, criminal fraud charges related to some of her own prior loan applications. The remaining $1.5 million, combined with additional funds Michael had apparently pulled from a home equity line against a property Eleanor and I had gifted him years earlier, had gone toward the down payment and initial furnishings of the mansion, structured under Gloria's LLC specifically, Harold explained, because doing so provided a legal buffer that would make it significantly harder to trace the fraud directly back to Michael in the event anyone, meaning me, ever came looking. "There's something else, William," Harold told me during our second meeting, sliding a folder across the diner table with a grim expression I had never seen on his face in the 15 years I had known him. I found correspondence, emails between Michael and an attorney specializing in elder law and guardianship proceedings. Dated 8 weeks ago. I opened that folder with hands that were, for the first time throughout this entire ordeal, not entirely steady. Inside were printed copies of emails, obtained through Harold's careful and entirely legal review of company server backups, that Michael, in his haste to protect himself, had apparently forgotten still synced automatically to a shared corporate cloud account. In those emails, Michael had written to an attorney, asking about the process for petitioning a court to have a family member declared mentally incompetent, referencing early signs of memory difficulty, and concerning financial decision-making he claimed to have observed in his father over recent months. The attorney's reply outlined, in clinical detail, the steps required to secure a court-ordered conservatorship, including medical evaluations that could, the attorney noted, sometimes be expedited with the right physician relationships. My own son was building a paper trail to have me declared incompetent, to seize legal control over everything I had spent 40 years building, not because I had shown a single genuine sign of memory trouble, but because it was the fastest, cleanest way to make the missing $3.4 million, and whatever else he intended to take, permanently unquestionable in a court of law. I sat in that diner booth for a long time after reading those emails, Harold quietly giving me space, and I understood in that moment that this had stopped being a story about a poorly structured house deed weeks ago. This was a calculated plan, built in stages, to strip an old man of both his fortune and his voice before he ever had the chance to object. I remember driving home from that diner with Harold's folder sitting on the passenger seat beside me, unable to stop glancing at it at every red light, as though the papers inside might somehow rearrange themselves into a less devastating conclusion if I looked at them long enough. I thought about every family dinner over the past year where Michael had sat across from me, laughing at some old story, asking my advice on some minor business decision, all while quietly building the paperwork trail to have me declared unfit to manage my own affairs. I thought about the day he graduated college, the pride on his face when I handed him the keys to Harper Industrial Consulting 3 years ago, the speech I gave at his wedding to Emma, about trusting the next generation to carry a legacy forward with integrity. Every one of those memories now sat beside this folder, like a photograph, slowly developing into something unrecognizable. I did not confront Michael. I did not confront Emma or Gloria. I called Gerald that same night and told him everything Harold had found. Gerald, careful as always, told me the emails alone, even legally obtained, would likely not be enough on their own to bring criminal charges, but combined with the shell company payments, the forged consulting invoices, and Gloria's documented debt history, we now had the foundation for something far more serious than a family dispute. We had the foundation for a criminal fraud referral, embezzlement charges against Michael personally, and, Gerald noted with quiet satisfaction, more than enough grounds to preemptively and permanently block any future guardianship petition Michael might attempt to file against me. "Here's what we're going to do, William," Gerald told me. "We are going to let them believe they still have time. We are going to let them plan whatever final move they're building toward. Because the moment they believe they've cornered you, they will make a mistake big enough to end this cleanly, in public, in a way no judge or jury will ever be able to look past." I agreed. And so, for the following 3 weeks, I played the part of a slightly bewildered, slightly forgetful old man, misplacing my keys in front of Michael on purpose during a visit, repeating a story I had already told him the week before, watching, with a strange and heavy sadness, as I saw the beginnings of relief cross his face each time, as though every small performance of confusion I offered him was one more brick in the wall he was building around my own mind. During those weeks of pretending to be reassured, I forced myself to attend a barbecue at Michael and Emma's mansion, a smaller, more casual gathering than the housewarming had been, perhaps a dozen guests scattered across the back lawn near the pool. I remember standing near the grill with Michael, a beer in each of our hands, and he turned to me at one point, unprompted, and said, "You know, Dad, I really appreciate you not making a big deal out of that whole house deed thing. I know it probably looks strange from the outside," I told him, keeping my voice as warm and unbothered as I could manage. that I trusted him to know what he was doing with his own finances, that a father's job eventually was to step back and let his son make his own decisions, even ones he might have made differently himself. Michael smiled at that, relieved, clapping me on the shoulder, and I remember the specific, sick feeling in my stomach as I smiled back at him, knowing exactly what sat in a folder in Harold's home office 2 miles away, knowing exactly what those deleted financial folders had actually contained, and understanding, with a clarity that nearly took my breath away, that I was now the only person at that barbecue who understood precisely how much danger our entire family was actually standing in. 2 weeks later, an invitation arrived. It came addressed to both Eleanor and me, embossed cream cardstock, elegant script announcing a Harper family celebration dinner to be held at the mansion, 3 weeks out, with a guest list, Michael mentioned casually over the phone, of nearly 400 people, business associates, extended family, several of my own former colleagues from the industry I had spent my life in. "We just want to celebrate everything, Dad," he told me, his voice warm in a way that, knowing what I now knew, chilled me far more than any anger could have. "The house, the family, all of it. You and Mom are the guests of honor." Gerald, when I told him about the invitation, went very quiet on the phone for a moment. "William, I think I know exactly what this dinner is going to be," he finally said. A guardianship petition of the kind Michael has been researching typically benefits enormously from a public setting where the petitioner can stage what looks like a natural witness decline, memory lapses, confusion, disorientation, all performed in front of a large crowd who can later be called as character witnesses if the matter goes before a judge. "I believe your son intends to use this dinner to build exactly that narrative in front of 400 witnesses, and I would not be surprised if there is a final round of paperwork somewhere in that evening as well, something they intend to get you to sign while you are, in their eyes, distracted, flattered, and off guard." We spent the following 3 weeks preparing with the same precision I once reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. Harold finalized a complete forensic accounting package, documenting every fraudulent payment, every shell company, every forged invoice, cross-referenced against Gloria's debt records and bank statements. Gerald filed, quietly and preemptively, a legal declaration establishing my full mental competency through an independent geriatric neuropsychological evaluation I underwent voluntarily at a respected clinic 2 hours outside the city, specifically so that no future guardianship petition against me could credibly claim I had refused or avoided such an evaluation. The results, unsurprising to anyone who has watched me run a company of over 1,000 employees well into my late 60s, showed cognitive function well within the healthy range for my age, a document Gerald filed under seal, ready to be produced the instant it was needed. Marissa Boone, the same retired detective who had assisted Gerald and me on a prior matter years earlier, was brought in once again to coordinate discreetly with the county's financial crimes unit. Given the scale of the embezzlement, now confirmed at $3.4 million in company funds, diverted through fraudulent consulting payments, plus the home equity funds pulled against a property I still held partial legal interest in, the prosecutor's office agreed the case met the threshold for a coordinated arrest, provided we could establish the right moment and the right evidence trail to execute it cleanly. I chose the dinner. Gerald, as he had once before, cautioned me gently about how it might appear, staged, theatrical, vindictive in front of a jury someday, if it ever came to that. I told him I understood the risk completely, and that I was willing to accept it, because my son had chosen to build a case for my incompetence in front of an audience, and I intended for the truth to arrive with exactly the same audience watching. The night of the dinner arrived on a clear, cool evening in late autumn. Eleanor and I dressed carefully, and before we left the house, I held both her hands in mine at our own kitchen table and told her, honestly, everything Gerald and Harold and Marissa had helped me build over the past several weeks. She listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with every new detail. And when I finished, she squeezed my hands and said quietly, 40 years, William. 40 years, we gave that boy everything, and this is what he decided to build with it. I did not have an answer for her that made either of us feel better. I simply held her hands a little tighter and told her that whatever happened that night, we were going to face it together, the same way we had faced everything else. Before we left our house that evening, Gerald called one final time to confirm every piece of the plan was in place. Marissa's team would remain staged 2 blocks from the mansion in unmarked vehicles, waiting for a signal from Gerald's phone. Once the confrontation reached its critical point, Harold would be present as well, seated at a table near the back of the tent, under the guise of an old family friend, ready to step forward with his documentation the moment it was needed. Gerald himself would arrive 15 minutes after Eleanor and I did, timed carefully so as not to raise suspicion among Michael or Emma, who knew him only as Dad's old business attorney, and had no reason to expect his presence at what was billed as a family celebration. "Are you certain about this, William?" Gerald asked me one final time before we hung up. "Once this starts, there's no putting it back in the box. I've been certain since the moment my wife grabbed my arm and told me we needed to leave," I told him. "I just needed the time to make sure that when I finally said something, nobody in that room would be able to say I was wrong." The mansion was even more dazzling that second time, lit from every angle. Valets in matching vests lining the circular drive, nearly 400 guests eventually filling the great room, the terrace, and a large white tent erected on the back lawn overlooking the pool. String lights wrapped every tree along the property line. A 12-piece orchestra played from a raised platform near the fountain. Emma greeted us at the door in a stunning gold gown, embracing Eleanor warmly, telling her how wonderful it was to have the whole family together for such a special night. A phrase that landed very differently in my ears than it would have 3 weeks earlier. Dinner was served at a long banquet table set up beneath the white tent. Gold chargers, towering floral centerpieces, place cards written in elegant calligraphy. I was seated, deliberately I now understood, at the head of the table, positioned exactly where every guest's eyes would naturally fall throughout the evening, exactly where a man's confusion, if performed correctly, would be witnessed by the maximum possible number of people. Michael stood partway through the main course, tapping his champagne glass for attention, the orchestra quieting on cue. He gave a warm, polished toast about family, about legacy, about everything my father taught me about building something that lasts. A toast that, had I not known what I now knew, would have brought tears to my eyes, the way it clearly brought tears to several guests around the table. He thanked Eleanor for raising a man who understood the value of hard work. He thanked me last, his eyes finding mine down the length of that long table, and said, "And to my father, who taught me everything I know, we have something special for you tonight, Dad. A little surprise, to make sure this house, this family, everything we've built, stays exactly where it belongs, in the Harper name, for generations to come." A younger associate I recognized as one of Emma's colleagues stepped forward with a leather folio, walking it down the length of the table and setting it directly in front of me, along with an elegant fountain pen laid across the top. Michael remained standing, smiling warmly at the gathered crowd. "It's just a small estate planning update, Dad. Nothing complicated. Our family attorney drew it up. Just needs your signature to make sure everything is protected and properly structured for the future. We didn't want to bother you with the details. We know how much you trust us to handle these things." I looked down at that folio. I did not need to open it to know, with absolute certainty, exactly what it contained. Gerald had warned me this moment might come, that the final document Michael would attempt to have me sign in front of witnesses would likely be framed innocuously, an estate update, a trust restructuring, something a distracted, flattered, aging father might sign, without reading closely in front of 400 people who trusted his son completely. I opened the folio slowly, the entire table watching, Michael's smile still fixed in place, Emma's hand resting lightly on his shoulder, Gloria seated 3 chairs down watching me, with an expression I can only describe now as barely concealed hunger. I flipped through 3 pages of dense legal language, and there it was, exactly as Gerald had predicted, a voluntary transfer of my remaining equity interests, my personal real estate holdings, and irrevocable power of attorney over all future financial and medical decisions, effective immediately upon signature, naming Michael as sole trustee. I picked up the pen. 400 guests watched in warm, champagne-soft silence as I lifted that fountain pen off the leather folio, turned it slowly between my fingers under the string lights, and then, with a single deliberate motion, snapped it cleanly in half. The sound of it, small as it was, cracked across that entire tent like a gunshot. The orchestra, mid-note, faltered into silence. Every conversation at every table died within seconds. 400 faces, turning toward the head of the table, toward the old man they had all assumed was simply enjoying a quiet family celebration. "Michael," I said, and I did not need to raise my voice, because the silence in that tent was already so complete that even a whisper would have carried to the farthest table. "I am not signing this, and as of this moment, you are terminated from any remaining role at Harper Industrial Consulting, effective immediately." Michael's smile did not simply fade, it collapsed, the color draining from his face so quickly that Emma reached out to steady his arm, without seeming to fully understand why yet. "Dad, what are you talking about? This is just an estate document. We already discussed this." "We discussed nothing, Michael," I said, standing slowly from my chair, my voice still level, still calm, the same calm I had carried into every difficult boardroom negotiation of my life. "You discussed it with Gloria, with an attorney specializing in guardianship petitions, with whoever helped you forge the paperwork trail to have me declared incompetent, so that none of what's in this folio could ever be challenged. What we are going to discuss tonight, in front of everyone your mother and I have known for 30 years, is exactly what you did with the $3.4 million you stole from a company that still carries my name." The gasp that moved through that tent was audible, a physical ripple across 400 people setting down their glasses in near unison. Emma's hand flew to her mouth. Gloria, 3 seats down, went absolutely white, her fork clattering against her plate. Right on cue, exactly as Gerald and Marissa had arranged with the county's financial crimes unit 48 hours earlier, the tent's side entrance opened. 4 plainclothes detectives, along with Gerald himself and Harold Weiss carrying a slim leather case, walked in with the same unhurried, professional calm I remembered from a very different celebration years before. "Michael Harper, Gloria Benson," the lead detective said, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned silence of the tent. "We need to speak with you both, regarding an active investigation into corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and the fraudulent transfer of company assets." Michael's chair scraped backward as he stood too fast, nearly knocking over a floral centerpiece. "This is insane. This is a celebration. You can't just walk in here." "I can, and I did, Michael," I said, still standing at the head of the table. "Because you were about to walk out of this tent with everything your mother and I spent 40 years building, using a piece of paper you hoped I'd sign without reading, surrounded by 400 people who would have made it very difficult for me to ever undo it afterward. So I made sure the truth arrived at the exact same party you built to steal from me." A ripple of murmured disbelief moved through the crowd as guests began quietly turning to one another, some standing from their chairs for a better view, phones now openly recording what had, moments earlier, been an elegant celebration and had transformed, in the space of under 2 minutes, into something else entirely. I caught sight of one of Michael's old college friends near the edge of the tent, mouth hanging open, and beside him, an elderly couple I recognized as longtime friends of Eleanor's parents, their faces etched with the particular shock of people watching a story unfold that they knew, instinctively, would be discussed at every dinner table in the county for months to come. Gerald stepped forward and calmly, methodically, in front of the entire stunned gathering, began laying out precisely what Harold's forensic accounting had uncovered. The 4 shell consulting firms, the $1.9 million that had vanished directly into Gloria's casino debts and collection accounts, the forged invoices for consulting work that had never been performed, the home equity funds pulled against a property that still legally required my signature for any lien, a signature Michael had, Harold's analysis confirmed, forged using a notary stamp obtained through a compromised acquaintance, now also under investigation. And finally, the emails, the ones outlining a plan to have me declared mentally incompetent, read aloud, word for word, to 400 guests, who had, only 20 minutes earlier, been toasting to family and legacy. "And there is one more thing all of you should know before this evening ends," I said, my eyes moving slowly across that stunned crowd, before settling back on my son. "This mansion, the one we are all standing on the grounds of tonight, was purchased using a corporate loan drawn against Harper Industrial Consulting's business credit line, secured under terms requiring continuous active employment of a company officer as a condition of the loan remaining in good standing. As of roughly 90 seconds ago, when I terminated my son's role at that company, that loan is now in active default. The bank will be initiating foreclosure proceedings within the week." The silence that followed that sentence was unlike anything I have experienced in 70 years of living. Somewhere near the back of the tent, a woman I recognized as one of Eleanor's oldest friends whispered, loud enough to carry, "Oh my God," and I watched the realization spread table by table, guest by guest, that the celebration they had been invited to was, in fact, the site of an elaborate theft, and that the quiet, gray-haired man at the head of the table had just dismantled it in less than 4 minutes. The lead detective stepped forward with a pair of handcuffs, reciting Michael's rights in the same flat, practiced tone I imagine he had used 100 times before, while nearly 400 guests sat frozen at their tables, phones raised, the 12-piece orchestra silent, string lights suddenly feeling garish rather than elegant, against the wreckage of a celebration that would never be finished. Michael's face, as the cuffs clicked around his wrists, cycled through an expression I had never once seen on my son in 34 years. Something between disbelief and a kind of collapsing recognition, the specific and terrible look of a man realizing, all at once, in front of everyone he had ever wanted to impress, that the story he had been telling himself for over a year was no longer sustainable. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking as the detective began walking him toward the tent's side entrance. "Dad, please. This isn't... I can explain. Just give me a chance to explain." "You had a year to explain it to me honestly, Michael," I said, still standing at the head of that long banquet table. "You chose to explain it with forged documents and a guardianship petition instead." Gloria, for her part, said nothing at all as the second detective approached her chair. She simply stood, smoothed the front of her navy gown with a strange, mechanical calm, and allowed herself to be led away without a single word of protest, though I noticed her eyes finding mine for just a moment as she passed, and in them I saw not shame, but something closer to cold calculation, the look of a woman already working out her next move, rather than reckoning with the one that had just failed. Detectives moved forward to formally detain Michael and Gloria, reading their rights amid the wreckage of a party that would never be finished, half-eaten plates of food going cold under string lights that suddenly felt garish rather than elegant. Emma stood frozen beside her husband's empty chair, tears streaking through carefully applied makeup, saying nothing, understanding, I think, faster than either her husband or her mother, that there would be no talking their way out of this one. Eleanor and I did not stay to watch them led out to the cars waiting in the circular drive. I offered my arm to my wife, and we walked, quietly, through the stunned crowd of 400 people, who parted without a word, out through the marble foyer, past the 8-foot chandelier, into the cool night air, and down the same gravel drive we had walked up hours earlier, believing we were attending a celebration. Neither of us spoke until we were in the car, the mansion glowing behind us in the rearview mirror for the second time in 6 weeks. This time for an entirely different reason. In the days immediately following that dinner, the story spread through our small business community faster than I had anticipated. Faster even than the yacht wedding story I had heard secondhand from an old friend years earlier about another local family's public unraveling. A regional business journal ran a piece within a week. Harper industrial founder uncovers son's embezzlement scheme at family celebration, and I found myself fielding calls from former colleagues, competitors, even a journalist or two, all wanting comment. I gave none. Gerald handled every inquiry with a short, practiced statement, and I retreated, as much as I could, into the quiet of our lake house, trying to process what had actually happened beneath the noise of everyone else's fascination with it. The legal proceedings that followed took nearly 10 months to fully resolve. Michael, facing charges of embezzlement, wire fraud, forgery, and conspiracy related to the guardianship scheme, spent the first several weeks after his arrest insisting to his attorney, and by extension to Gerald through formal correspondence, that the entire situation was a misunderstanding, that the consulting payments were legitimate, that the guardianship emails had been exploratory conversations, taken out of context. It was only after his attorney reviewed the complete weight of Harold's forensic documentation, the shell company registrations tracing directly to addresses connected to Gloria, the forged notary stamp on the home equity lien, the server backup emails detailing conversations with an elder law attorney about expediting my incompetency evaluation, that his position began to soften. I attended a settlement conference roughly 5 months after the arrest, at Gerald's suggestion, though I said very little during the 2 hours we sat in that conference room. Michael looked thinner than I remembered. The confidence that had carried him through that housewarming toast entirely gone, replaced by something more tired, more honest, in a way I found almost harder to witness than his earlier arrogance had been. His attorney ultimately negotiated a plea agreement after concluding, correctly, that a jury presented with the full scope of Harold's evidence would likely convict on every count and that a trial would result in a far harsher sentence than the negotiated deal on the table. He pled guilty to embezzlement and forgery charges, receiving 4 years in state prison with eligibility for parole after 30 months, along with a restitution order requiring full repayment of the $3.4 million to Harper Industrial Consulting, a debt that will follow him, Gerald assured me, for the rest of his working life, regardless of how long that repayment takes. Gloria Benson, facing separate charges for her role in the fraudulent shell companies and her knowing participation in the guardianship scheme, chose to fight the charges at trial rather than accept a plea, insisting through her attorney that she had simply been the passive beneficiary of her son-in-law's generosity and had no knowledge of how the consulting payments had actually been structured or funded. The trial lasted 8 days. I testified on the 3rd day, walking the jury through the timeline exactly as it happened. The housewarming party, Eleanor's grip on my arm, the title search, the deleted computer folders reflected in the glass wall of Michael's office. Harold testified on the 4th and 5th days, presenting his forensic accounting findings with the same methodical patience he had shown me in that diner months earlier, walking the jury through spreadsheet after spreadsheet, showing the money's true path from Harper Industrial Consulting's operating account, through the 4 shell companies, directly into Gloria's casino debts and collection accounts. Gloria's own defense ultimately undid her more than any evidence Harold or Gerald presented. Under cross-examination, when the prosecutor asked her to explain the specific consulting services her company had allegedly provided, in exchange for over $600,000 in a single quarter, she could not name a single deliverable, a single meeting, a single document produced. Her answers grew increasingly vague and contradictory across nearly 40 minutes of questioning, and I watched several jurors exchange glances that told me, long before the verdict came back, exactly which way this was going to end. She was convicted following that 8-day trial and sentenced to 6 years, the harsher sentence reflecting, the judge noted directly in his ruling, her sustained pattern of financial exploitation predating this specific scheme, evidenced by the collection records and prior fraud allegations Harold had uncovered during his initial review. Emma was never criminally charged, the investigation ultimately concluding she had limited direct knowledge of the embezzlement mechanics, though she filed for divorce from Michael 4 months after that night, a decision I understand, though I have had no direct contact with her since. The mansion, exactly as I stated that night in front of 400 witnesses, went into foreclosure within 3 weeks. The bank auctioned the property 8 months later. I did not bid on it. Eleanor and I have no desire to ever set foot on that property again, celebration or otherwise. The prison where Michael is currently serving his sentence sits nearly 2 hours from our new cottage, a drive Eleanor and I have made together only once, the first time, though I have gone alone since. She told me, gently, that she was not ready yet to sit across a plexiglass divider from the son she raised, that she needed more time before she could look at him without seeing, simultaneously, the boy who once fell asleep against her shoulder on long car rides, and the man who tried to have his own father declared incompetent for money. I understood completely. I am not certain, if our positions had been reversed, that I would have found the strength to make even the one visit I have made without her beside me. I have visited Michael twice since his sentencing began. The first visit, he would not look at me for the better part of an hour, staring at the table between us in that visitation room, until finally he asked, in a voice smaller than I had heard from him since he was a boy, whether I had known, that whole final month, exactly what he and Gloria had been planning. I told him yes. I told him I had known for weeks before that dinner, and that I had chosen to let it unfold exactly as they built it, because I needed the truth to arrive with the same audience the lie had been built in front of. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he asked me the question I had been waiting for, dreading and hoping for all at once. Why didn't you just confront me privately, Dad? Why did it have to be like that, in front of everyone? I told him the truth. I told him that a private confrontation would have given him and Gloria room to maneuver, to destroy evidence, to file that guardianship petition before I ever had the chance to stop it, and that I had learned, across 40 years in business, and now across the hardest 6 months of my life, that some kinds of betrayal only stop when the truth is witnessed by enough people that there is no longer any room left to lie about it. He did not have an answer for that. I am not certain, even now, that there is one. My second visit came 4 months after the first, on a gray afternoon in early winter. Michael looked different that time, thinner still, but steadier somehow, a quiet resolve settling into his face that reminded me, uncomfortably, of my own reflection during those long weeks I spent gathering evidence against him. He told me he had started working in the prison's small library, cataloging donated books, and that he had begun writing letters, not just to me, but to Grace, his daughter, trying to explain himself in a way he hoped she might understand someday when she was older. "I'm not asking you to forgive me, Dad," he said, echoing almost exactly what I would later hear. Strangely, in another father's story, a friend once told me about his own son's downfall. "I just needed you to know, I think about that night every single day. Not the arrest. The toast. The moment I stood up and thanked you for teaching me everything I know, right before I tried to take everything you'd built. I sat with that for a long moment, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, a guard pacing slowly near the far wall, and I told my son the only thing I had left to offer him in that room. That the door was not locked. That it would take years, possibly the rest of both our lives, before either of us knew whether he could walk back through it honestly. But that I was not the one who had closed it in the first place, and I was not going to be the one who nailed it shut either. Eleanor and I sold our lake house 11 months ago, and moved into a smaller cottage further from town. Quieter, simpler, exactly the kind of place we always said we would retire to, before Harper Industrial Manufacturing became large enough to demand otherwise. We fish together most mornings, the way we did in the early years of our marriage, and we do not talk about the mansion, or the dinner, or the sound of that pen snapping in half. Though I know Eleanor still flinches sometimes at the sound of a champagne toast on television, a small physical echo of a betrayal neither of us expected to survive, let alone from our only child. Grace has become, in many ways, the quiet center of what remains of our family in the aftermath of everything. She stays with us most weekends now, her mother having moved 2 states away shortly after Michael's arrest, and Eleanor has taken to teaching her the same watercolor painting she took up years ago during our first retirement. The two of them sitting at the kitchen table some afternoons with brushes and half-finished landscapes between them. A small, quiet ritual that has done more to heal this house than anything a courtroom ever could. Grace does not ask about her father often, but when she does, her questions are careful, thoughtful, the questions of a girl trying to understand a betrayal too large for someone her age to have been asked to carry at all. My granddaughter, Michael's daughter, from a brief relationship before his marriage to Emma, a thoughtful 16-year-old named Grace, who has stayed close to Eleanor and me throughout all of this, asked me once why I never simply cut Michael off entirely, why I still visit him, why I answer his letters even now. I told her what I have come to understand at 69 years old, sitting on a porch overlooking a much smaller, much quieter lake than the one we used to have. Love does not require you to hand someone the keys to everything you built. It only requires you to keep the door open long enough for them to find their own way back through it. Honestly, on their own 2 feet, without anyone else's forgery paving the road for them. Sometimes, on quiet mornings by our new smaller lake, I think back to that gravel driveway 6 weeks before everything unraveled. The warm golden lights of that mansion glowing behind us in the rearview mirror, Eleanor's hand still trembling in her lap as she told me what she had found in that study. I think about how close I came to simply confronting Michael that same week, in anger, without evidence, without Gerald or Harold or Marissa, and how thoroughly that approach would have failed against a scheme built with as much patience and precision as the one my son and his mother-in-law had constructed. I do not regret waiting. I do not regret the 6 weeks I spent smiling at my son over barbecue chicken, while Harold quietly built a case strong enough to survive a courtroom. What I have come to understand, at 69 years old, sitting beside the woman I have loved for over 4 decades, is that the people who try to bury you rarely expect you to still be standing there, shovel in hand, when they finally look up from the hole they dug for you, and realize it was always meant for them instead. I am 69 years old, and I have finally learned that the strongest thing a quiet man can do is let the people trying to bury him keep digging. right up until the moment they realized the shovel was always in his hands. If this story moved you even a little, please hit like, subscribe to Humble Dad Stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. There are more stories like this one coming, and I promise you, every single one of them ends the same way. Quietly, completely, justly.